And so when the Federal Reserve looks at the situation around the world, they really don't like what they see. Most countries are more like Canada, where there just isn't a replacement generation without immigration, and most countries are not Canada and so cannot handle the immigration. Most countries are more like Germany or Italy or China, and we are looking at the end of what we consider normal economics, because there are no longer going to be enough young people in the world to carry things forward, whether it's childbirth, tax payments, or economic growth in general. So the Federal Reserve is not primarily looking at today's economic fundamentals in making these decisions with interest rates. I'm not suggesting they're ignoring them. Obviously, inflation is part of the conversation, but they are far more concerned about what happens after the next expansion. Because if you fast forward just 5 years, interest rates won't work in most places. They won't work in Germany or China or Japan or Korea or Taiwan or Thailand at all, because there's no more demand to regulate. And in Canada, it will only work if Trudeau gets his way and you're able to import 300,000 to 500,000 new Canadians every year for the next 5 years in order to generate the population that will then generate the demand. They're trying to prepare enough dry powder so that the next time they need to lower interest rates, they have enough dry powder to do it and make a difference, because they will be trying to shift the entire world off of the consumption of just one country. And so I don't think they're going to stop until they get to at least 6, because that's kind of the minimum that they've kind of penciled in as to what would allow them to get through the next crisis, not this one.
There's a popular saying, I'm sure you've heard it before, don't fight the Fed. You know, what's the incentive of government going?
That's fair.
What's the incentive of the government going to be over the next decade and the decade after that?
The biggest challenge the Fed is going to face is as the Chinese and the German systems fail, we need to double the size of industrial plant in the United States in an environment where baby boomer capital is going to be increasingly unavailable. So the credit costs that is necessary when Gen X is the one providing the credit are going to be huge. And so the Federal Reserve has to take steps within policy. I don't know if it's going to be interest rate policy, but within policy to loosen up credit to make that to be an easier process, because the alternative is inflation that's north of 10% for several years. I'm not sure there is a magical policy set that will let that happen, but maybe some version of quantitative easing might. I don't know. We're not just getting out of my skill set here. We're getting out of traditional monetary policy tools, because we are entering a fundamentally new era. So paying for that, financing that, at the same time we say we want to do the green transition, and all of that has to be front-loaded as well, because the 80% of the cost for wind and solar is installation. The fuel's free. Costs just as much over the lifetime as fossil fuels, but it's all front-loaded. That all has to be financed. And then, of course, paying for the baby boomers' retirement, because the baby boomers certainly didn't save enough to do it. So those are our 3 big expenses. The last one is lost money. The second one is a political question. The first one is what fuels the United States for the next 60 years. So all else being equal, I know where the Fed would prefer to put their effort, but the Fed's only one part of our economic management system. Congress gets a say in this, and Congress is the one who decides what happens to Social Security and our pension system and our healthcare system, and none of that is cheap.
You know, even though you're talking about the Fed, I think a lot of the major Western countries' central banks all move together. So
they're not. That's the thing. Not anymore. One of the things we've seen in this tightening cycle is, yes, other countries have tightened, but only by like an order of magnitude less. The Europeans have barely moved. The Japanese have only moved on paper. Just if you don't have a demographic structure where your interest rates shifts can actually affect consumption, then there's no point in changing them. So you're probably going to see a little bit of movement in places like Sweden that have a better demography than the rest, but there are only 2 other countries in the world that have a decent demography in the advanced world. That's New Zealand, where we're seeing interest rate moves, and France, which is part of the euro, so we're not.
Okay. Well, so in summary, what should Canadian mortgage lenders, brokers, and developers be mindful of as they plan their businesses for the next 5 years?
Well, let's start with the really trite thing. There is no Canada. there's a British Columbia, there's an Alberta, there's an Ontario, there's a Quebec, and they all have radically different property markets and radically different population structures, and that needs to be taken into account first and foremost in everything that you do. Second, to the degree that there is Canada, it's an immigration story, and that's a political question. You know you have to massively increase immigration in the aftermath of the COVID drop simply in order to hold still. If you want to participate in the North American industrial story, you need even more. And you've got to find a way to thread that needle between the newcomers who want property and the people who are already here who can no longer afford it. How you manage that politically, I would argue, is the single biggest crisis that Canada faces for the remainder of this decade.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about labor for a second. So I've heard you mentioned Canadian labor could be thought of as a competitor to U.S. labor, whereas Mexican labor is more complementary. Could you expand on your thinking there, and how does Canada fit into the mix?
It's a cost and a labor structure issue. So Mexico isn't unskilled. They haven't been unskilled for 20 years. They're semi-skilled. They're good at moving around pieces of metal. They're good at anything that requires eyes and hands that can't necessarily be automated, but they're even good at some types of automation. Canada and the United States are both good at the high end. We both do design. We both do high-end assembly systems. We both do intellectual work. We both do high-end wiring. And so there's always this built-in tension between the United States and Canada. The way it's worked to this point is each Canadian province has integrated more south than they have laterally. So for all intents and purposes in manufacturing, Ontario and Quebec and BC are American states in terms of manufacturing, and you're part of the milieu. But as Canada has aged demographically and the United States has not, or at least not as much, you're not going up the value-added scale anymore, but your labor is becoming more expensive. And perhaps some regulations are on top of that, complicating the issue. And that makes it very difficult for Canada to compete with the United States. Now, if Canada was on the other side of Mexico, you could benefit from Mexico in the same way that we can. But you're not. You're forced to try to integrate south. And in the case of Ontario, your best partner is Michigan and Ohio. Automotive, that works really well. But in the case of Quebec, it's aerospace. And the United States has some very pathologically formed opinions on aerospace. And one of the things we're going to see in the next couple of years is Airbus is going to go away. They get their aluminum from Russia. They get their titanium from Russia. And they get their engines and their wings from Britain. And Britain is applying for a free trade agreement with the United States, and we've made it very clear that one of the conditions is you join the Boeing family instead of the Airbus family. And so all of a sudden, Bombardier has to make some very, very hard decisions about their future. A lot of this is wrapped up in what Donald Trump did in NAFTA too. It is forcing a series of uncomfortable decisions on Canadian business about how to operate in an environment where the global structures are no longer there, and it really needs to focus on the United States and Mexico. As almost any country in the world will tell you, the most uncomfortable place is to be number 1 or number 2 on the United States' worry list. Until now, Canada's been like number 20 or number 25. And that's allowed Canada to ignore and avoid a lot of the scrutiny that comes in from when the Americans feel paranoid about something. We're not in that world anymore. As American interests shrink back to North America, all of a sudden Canada is going to consistently make the top 5 list. That's not a great place to be.
What are the opportunities that you see for Canada? And I guess more broadly, what does the future of the North American trade bloc look like to you?
Well, let's start with the punchline. North America is going to be the fastest growing economic bloc of size in the world for at least the next 30 years. And Mexico specifically is going to be one of the top 2 growth stories for that same time frame. So from my point of view, the hard work for the 3 countries has already been done. The intellectual infrastructure is in place. The trade deal has been ratified and implemented. We've already tested the adjudication mechanisms. They work. I feel very good about the long-term prognosis. The challenge is going to be that doubling of the industrial plant in the next 5 years as Germany and China go away. Mexico has already hit the ground running, and as of the Three Amigos Summit, which just concluded today, all three countries are trying to figure out how they can move more and more of the semiconductors and electronic supply chain into North America, which is great. The problem for Canada is it's not clear that they can directly benefit from a lot of that. Canada does not have the green space or the population density or the availability of labor in its major cities to do a semiconductor build-out. And a successful electronics manufacturing sector requires different skill sets at different price points. And Mexico is perfect for the United States for that because we've got the high-skilled labor right on the border with their mid-skilled labor. They can interact very, very easily. Canada is also high-skilled labor at the same price point. So the Mexican labor system in this sector is very complementary to U.S. labor. The Canadian system would be competitive, and the only way that Canada could exist in that space if they do the high value added stuff and ferry the intermediate products to Mexico via air. There are sectors where that model works, cell phones for example, but for run-of-the-mill semiconductors, no. And Canada does not have a domestic semiconductor skill set that is up high. So the sort of sectors that we face the biggest vulnerability in as a continent: electronics, computing, cellular. That takes a lot of skilled labor. And Canada has a shortage of labor. So for Canada to pull this out of the fire, they need those 500,000 people a year. And they have to have a place to be here, and they need homes.
Awesome.
You already have a better social welfare system. You already have a better healthcare system the United States does. Not that that's a high bar, but it does make it easier to integrate people from different backgrounds. You need to do more of that in more parts of the country as quickly as possible. And that means encouraging people to live somewhere other than just the gateway cities, so you can make this as broad-based and sustainable as you possibly can. And if you can pull that off, Canada will be an inseparable part of the North American experience, and it will enjoy years of the fastest economic growth in its entire history. And so will Mexico. And so will the United States. Ultimately, this is a really good story, but we're all going to have to do some uncomfortable things in order to get there.
So what about the smaller cities, and should we be trying to attract people to our smaller towns?
You need them everywhere. And I understand the difficulty of attracting people to something that's not a gateway city. But when I look at the economic potential of Canada, the manufacturing possibilities for Quebec and Ontario, we've already kind of dealt with. I think there's a very strong case there, but of course people are going to be moving to the city. But Canada is renowned for exporting unprocessed commodities, whether it's mining or agriculture. If all you did is do a little bit of processing and some value added in your secondary cities, particularly in the prairies, the jobs that would come up from that would be beyond lucrative and should prove sufficient to draw people from international. If you're looking for an example in the States, look at the state of Iowa. It's not the most exciting place to live, but it's really the only American state that has kind of invested in going up the value-added chain, not just from plant agriculture to animal agriculture, but the processing in order to do the soy crushing and make the oils and make the flour, whatever it happens to be, to send out a value-added product instead of just the raw commodity.
Okay, last question for you. Some of tech's biggest promises are pretty bold. For instance, robotics could possibly change the way geography matters with respect to manufacturing and labor, and artificial intelligence in particular. I mean, I don't know about you, but my Christmas break was dominated by everybody playing with ChatGPT. I don't know. Have you had a chance to play with ChatGPT?
I have, yes.
I mean, it's quite fascinating. What do you make of it all? Where do you see artificial intelligence, robotics, perhaps 3D printing? How do you see that all impacting your thesis and this coming decades?
I expect the rate of technological progress to slow considerably for the next 20 years. In order to do tech of any type, you need a lot of people in their 20s and their 30s who are highly interconnected in order to synergize, and you need a lot of capital to pay for the workers, to build out the systems in their prototype form and then to apply it in mass, and everyone forgets this step, to keep updating the systems that are already in place as the technology improves. That takes more than everything else put together. We're not in that world anymore. The world's been aging out. We're running out of 20 and 30 somethings, and we're running out of capital because of the retiring boomers. So the pace is always going to slow. We're seeing that with the Silicon Valley layoffs right now. And then second, even if you can solve the production side of the equation with automation, robots don't buy stuff. Trade requires consumption. So you have to have both. And automation can only help with the first piece of that. So in places where the capital structure is good, and you still have a large number of young people, and you have a lot of consumption, their tech is going to continue. It's going to be part of the solution. It's going to continue to move forward, if at a slower pace.